You're listening to the Entrepreneur's Agony Aunt podcast, keeping it real, telling the story like it is, because there are no mistakes that somebody else hasn't already made. Hello, I'm Vicky Brock, and you're listening to the Entrepreneur Agony Aunt podcast. Back by popular demand, his as well as yours, is Mark Logan, IOD Director of the Year, former Skyscanner COO, Startup Advisor and NXD. So welcome back to my living room, Mark.
Thank you, Vicky.
And I'm sorry about the strange green sofa cover, which doesn't match, but the nice black and white one is in the wash, which is an amazing thing. Like, IKEA has made washable sofa covers, which is a truly good thing, and I'm grateful for it. It's been about 16 episodes since we first sat here, Mark, and we've both been out meeting and mentoring loads of founders and loads of companies. I'd love to know what you've seen and what you've learned in that time, because it must have been quite a different experience for you being out there and meeting tons of people in this context.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think that the first thing I've learned is there's a very large amount of startup activity, which is great. If you think about it, people say, when's the next Skyscanner coming? Well, the next Skyscanner depends on a large amount of startup activity because it's a funnel issue. And it's great to see so many very engaged entrepreneurs and teams trying to do something similar. So that's been really good. For me, it's been interesting from an organisational perspective to see the same patterns of problems that I've struggled with in my career. And you can only ever work at one company at a time, by and large, and you're never sure if this is your problem only or if it's a general problem. But to see those replicated in many places is quite reassuring rather than a negative, because it means that the same solutions will work for everybody. So I've found that very interesting. I think on the downside of that, it is striking how many startups, not the ones that I work with necessarily, but just generally as you walk through this space, and I'm sure you've seen the same thing, are in the process of failing slowly and don't know it. I liken it to, if you go to have a picnic in a forest somewhere and the family's having their cake and enjoying the sunshine, the lovely trees, you're unaware that the trees are out there trying to kill each other.
Yeah.
But they do it so slowly. They're striving to get more light than the other ones around them. You can't see this because it happens at a speed below our kind of consciousness. We're not very good at long-term things. And a startup that's failing doesn't fail at speed that you can detect when you're in it, but nevertheless is failing. And it comes back to some fundamentals I'm sure we'll talk about as we go through this podcast. So that's been quite alarming, and I think if there's one thing I could urge every startup to do is don't, and we've talked about this before, but don't replace a rigorous analysis of your business performance with activity. Activity is a drug. If I do activity, I must be doing something good. Being busy is not necessarily being right, but that's the mistake a lot of startups are making. Yeah,
and I'm going to come back to that in this, because I think the whole concept of an MVP has got a lot to answer for, because it is a busy thing to be doing. Yeah, I've been out, we've crossed paths and overlapped some of the companies as we've been out. I've seen loads of activity, which is really inspiring, and like you, I've found some common themes. I think it is a funnel issue. I was just saying to you before I pressed record, I'm working with about 5 right now, working quite closely with them, and they're all excellent in their various ways. But I have seen a lot to get to the point that there's 5 that I really am able to invest a fair bit of time and energy into, and some of them you don't need to invest that much. You can literally share the one piece of wisdom that you have that's relevant to them and move on, and they gain. But the failing slowly is interesting, because it's not even restricted to quite early stage companies. I've seen 1 or 2 who've got quite a bit of money behind them, caught perhaps in a loop that their funding is perpetuating. I don't think there's any shame in embracing the startup as a temporary thing, and when you have validated the idea out of existence, accepting that as a perfectly successful outcome and moving on to the next one. Which brings us to the next question, and it's actually from a startup employee, but it really resonated with me. They submitted it through the form. You can submit your question through this form. You'll find it at vickybrock.com/podcast. And they write, I've worked in a number of startups, and here's something I'm interested in exploring. In a lot of cases, the founder is A, the smartest person in the room, and B, often quite capricious in their focus. Now, I get that in some cases that's going to be inevitable. You have to hunt for product market fit and you need to pivot quickly. But it often feels to the wider team that they are left dealing with the fallout of sudden changes in focus. And it also leads to worry that there is really no focus at all. Do you have any insights on whether this is really a thing? And if so, how should it be managed? It's really hard to meet your targets and deliver on plans when they keep changing. That's a really interesting question. Is this nimbleness and flexibility, or is it something more problematic, do you think?
Yeah, it's a very, very good question, and it's a chronic issue, I think, across many companies of many sizes. So let's try and unpack this a little bit, because a business which is operating rigorously to a lean startup style model of learning metrics and pivoting when it needs to pivot will, from time to time decide that priorities need to be changed. Another example of a legitimate change is where, for example, a new technology wave arrives and causes you to have to respond to it. So mobile was a great recent example of that. I think machine learning is going to be another one. And none of us like to have to change our operational plans or development plans, but sometimes there are very legitimate reasons for it. And the questioner here isn't talking about those cases, but it's important before we dive into their question that we don't sort of suggest that all such changes of direction, suddenly or otherwise, are negative, because often they're necessary for the survival
There's these
of
all
business.
it's the five forces, isn't it? All the externalities, from regulatory to competition to kind of changes in context, and those things are things that you have to respond
Absolutely.
to, or you'll die.
Yes, or sometimes you just have to realise that, we've got more information now, and we were wrong, or hadn't thought about this clearly enough, so now it's time to incorporate that new information. These are all very legitimate cases, and if somebody found that too much to deal with, then they shouldn't be in the startup or tech, fast-moving, fast-growing world. Now let's take that set of legitimate cases and put them to the side and expose the questioner's case of, all things being equal, I have the word was used, capricious founder, CEO, whichever, that regularly changes priorities. Now, this is a very, very common problem, and if you think about the gearing on this, it's always easier to think of ideas than it is to implement them, and that's the foundation of the issue. Related to that foundation is the fact that a founder will start off as one or two people, and if they want to think of an idea, or think of this as a flow, a pipeline, the rate of idea production is gated by the rate of idea implementation, because they are implementing the damn stuff. So they naturally gate their own idea creation. But once you separate the founder from implementation, then the founder is no longer constrained by the bottleneck of implementation and gets free to generate ideas very quickly. At the same time as the company starts to take shape, the founder has new pressures upon him or her from the board, investors who haven't lived in the practitioner's world and expect progress, quickly. So that creates a double effect of the founder feeling that they need to do more there. And the other thing that happens to founders quite often is you always go through this identity crisis of what's my value to this business. I'm no longer writing the code, for example, that happens with a software business. Therefore, what's my value? My value is I come up with visionary ideas, so I'm going to do more of that.
Yeah.
You can see how people get to this phase, but the root mechanical issue is that you've decoupled the founder from the constraint of implementation, so they're free to locally optimize, and that means generate lots of ideas. And it's one of these vicious circles, because when founders or CEOs demand attention, they get that attention from the very people who would otherwise be implementing the last set of priorities. So the bottleneck is implementation, and the very act of creating more ideas makes that bottleneck even narrower, because we're taking time away to write up papers or create slides or scope stuff you're never going to implement. I mean, it's a chronic and acute problem in so many businesses. Now, I'm stating something that I think a lot of people will recognise. The question is, what can be done about it? Now, I'm going to make the assumption here that, you're in a position where you can influence certain things, but you can't tell the founder to stop it.
Yeah.
Go behave.
The only person who's ever been able to do that is when I co-founded with my husband, who was my head of product, and he was like, "You are not coming in product meetings. No, go away." That's a rare scenario.
He's a braver man than I am. I found the only way I've found, maybe other ways, but the only way I've found to mitigate this issue is to reunite the founder with the constraints of implementation. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means, and not necessarily that the founder needs to start coding. That's obviously probably not a good idea after a certain point, for a whole bunch of obvious reasons. But if you think about the cycle from here's a great idea, we should do this, through to properly defining that idea, to scoping it, to kind of user focus testing it, to whatever the steps you may have, it's really important to try and insert the originator of those ideas in this particular scenario into some part of that process, because it's naturally gating. Example, that's a really great idea about starting this new product line. We're going to need you as the originator of this idea to be part of the team that builds out the analysis of it. That's going to need some of your time, but the team's going to need that because, and I'm not saying this in a kind of patronising sense, that's often the case, that you do need that insight. But if you make the mistake of saying, thanks for that idea, we'll run with this, then what you're doing is you've just freed up the founder to have another idea. That founder has to have inertia by being part of the expansion of that idea, and that tends to gate things a little better.
And that's really interesting because I've seen it happen where I've done it accidentally, because as I've said many times, I have like dozens of ideas a day. Well, before breakfast, I have dozens of ideas, and some will stick in my brain. And at the moment I've got a new idea, it is the best idea ever. Like, without question, it is better than every idea I've ever had before for that brief moment. And when I'm in a mode like this, I go away, I get my Bill Owlett's 24 Steps to Disciplined Entrepreneurship, and by lunchtime it's like a rubbish idea and I'm on to the next one. Or it's actually validated through and it sticks. So I've actually, as you were talking about gating, I've got that bit where there's only a maximum level of throughput I can have, because if it's gotten me obsessed enough to care about it, and I'm now working on my steps to see if it deserves to live. But I've been in meetings just having ideas like I have conversation, not really understanding that as the CEO or as the founder, people take you seriously, listen to that and do what you said, whether it was a stupid idea or not. And it took me a while to realise I needed to build a structure. And partly it took my husband, who was confident enough to go, "You've done it again." I used to get a WhatsApp message going, "Undo what you just did," which is a very rare scenario that you can have that. But I actually started to get quite deliberate of building in a validation process. Is there a business case here? What's going to come off the list in order to make something else go onto the list, largely to manage my own disruption of the company. But I can really see that if the founder hasn't got anywhere else where that's stopping them, and it must make them feel, I know it used to make me feel better and valued and useful, that I just had another great idea, like, yay, I have a purpose here, another great idea. Is it something that you can manage up? I suppose if the culture's right, you can kind of call it out and joke about it, and if the culture's wrong, it can become quite tyrannical.
Yes, it can be very difficult. I think it's useful to separate tactical from strategic solutions. So what I've just described in terms of, gating the flow by including the originator of ideas in the implementation stage, that's a tactic. There's other tactics. Tactics aren't necessarily negative things. So another tactic is all ideas need to go through a simple spreadsheet exercise of give it a score from 1 to 5 on impact, difficulty, strategic relevance.
I love that. I used to do that all of the time because it's just a really easy, dispassionate way of going, no.
Yeah, because it removes the idea from being your creation to being a thing with 5 attributes, and you're talking about each attribute. So it's a very good way of deprogramming some of the stresses and tensions that you see in prioritisation meetings, for example.
Yeah.
So that can be useful in this case as well. But these are all tactics. If we go back to the problem you described, or the question I described of, in this case, the founder is generating ideas too quickly, let's then go up a level and say, what's the actual problem here? The kind of root problem, and that then gives us the strategic issue. The root problem is that the founder is exhibiting scale out already. We find it difficult to scale companies. We find it difficult to scale ourselves. The thing that's hardest, or the hardest scaling task, is for the founder, because at stage 1 you had to come up with ideas and implement them. It's very easy to forget to change. So you're no longer implementing, but you're still generating ideas. That's a problem. You need to gate your ideas to the organisation's ability to respond to them. Over time, founders get that eventually if they're getting somewhere, but they still struggle, for example, quite often to maintain consistency of message. So it's the same idea, but I'm playing now with how I describe the idea.
Oh yeah, it evolves in your head, and it gone from this simple little thing to this whole technical vision in your head, and actually catching up with the communication of that.
Yeah, or the metaphor, you're refining it all the time because you sleep it, dream it, all that stuff. But even that, if you've got a better version of your narrative, you've got to discipline yourself to not now release it to the organisation till a well-defined point. Because what you're creating all the time you communicate with your team is a level of entropy. So if you think about the company scaling and the founder scaling within it, you've got these self-awareness phases of, when do I need to stop doing this or do less of this? It's still a valuable thing to do. Ideas, super important. Ideas from the visionary in the business, extremely valuable. Improving the metaphor for how the strategy is communicated, really important. But the thing you're having to throttle as the organisation grows is frequency. You can only have one major strategic alteration per year after a certain size. And a founder who doesn't, strategically throttle that stuff is exhibiting scale out. So I think that, in an ideal relationship between a founder and other senior people, a priori, before all this becomes an issue, you want to have said, as we go through these scale points, we're going to have to change our behaviours like this, and so that when it happens, you can say, hey Bob or hey Sue, you're doing that thing you said you weren't going to do. Now, in the real world, that's kind of difficult. As anyone who's tried to be, Donald Trump's chief of staff, it's very difficult to retrofit these things. So you have to use tactics such as the ones I described earlier. Now, I don't mean when I say this to sound a note of patronising our founders, but rather the founder's got a responsibility to be aware of when he or she needs to adjust to not scale out. And if you're not willing to do that, you're not aware enough to do it, the people around you are going to patronise you with tactics. So, otherwise the business is going to fail. Yeah.
Some of this is the stage of the business, because product market fit and MVP are overused, but they are issues, and they're issues that often pop up later than any first-time founder expects. They don't expect 5 years, 6 years, 7 years in that their product isn't perfectly dovetailed to their market in quite the way that they thought. Although interestingly, Tom talked about this in episode 16, and I also talked about it with Leah Hutchin, is it's generally not the product part of product market fit that's the problem. It's are you at the right market, going at the right way, understanding your buy-in unit, pricing it. It's often, and especially in later stage business, that part of it that you haven't got right, not the product piece. But there is, if you're following, your lean startup or your disciplined entrepreneurship, and you're kind of going through this systematic iteration process, there is a time and a place for that. And that's fun, and it's busy, and for the founding team, especially the founder CEO, that's what they're really good at. That's why they're there. But there then comes a point in the business where it's get on and execute and get something to market and being sold, and you've got people who are being measured on that outcome being achieved, and then you've got a type of founder or as you say, a level of scale of founder, and has the founder not scaled up with it, who's actually holding right back on that. I've seen it. I personally tried very hard to make sure I wasn't that kind of person, because I know how prone to ideaing and how much I enjoy it I would be if left to my own natural devices. But Dennis Mortensen, 5-time founder, he gave me great advice when I started my last company, and I interviewed him quite recently. He talks about hyper-focus, and he talks about how he, especially in the early phases, drives his company on a single metric. So his current one is an AI tool that schedules meetings, and they have a great single metric on plasma screens right across the office, which is how many meetings have been scheduled today. And that is the one thing that they're all working towards. And he doesn't make a big deal about recurring revenue. He doesn't make a big deal about how much money is left in the bank. It's like all about this. And he does that to hyper-focus every one of his team members on the right thing. And I wonder if the flip side of what the person's asking in this question or pointing out in this question is that sometimes the actual business level focus, the what are we doing, why are we doing it, and how do we know if we're doing it right, is missing.
Yes, because sometimes this thrashing about for new ideas is an implicit awareness, and sometimes the founder has that awareness first, that the market doesn't want your product. So it's often a sign of we haven't got product market fit. Now, it'd be useful to, let's go back over some of the things you covered there, Vicky, because the more I work with companies and talk to people who are doing the same thing, and the more experience I've gained in life, the more I realise that this product market fit thing falls right into the category of a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. So let's unpack that a little bit. So first of all, the lean startup is a bit like Moby Dick or Ulysses, which is to say everyone's got a copy, but very few of them have read it. So a lot of people are using MVP and so on, but haven't actually read the book. And it's surprising how many people that applies to. It's a big issue. So we set off with the superficialities of the lean startup approach without the actual understanding of them. So, I'd urge everybody to fix that.
Read the bit about metrics, because like the MVP
especially the bit about
sits with metrics. Has it worked? It's a hypothesis, it's a test, not a throw spaghetti at the wall and see what sticks.
Absolutely. And I think the second issue with the lean startup or the product market fit concept is that the product market fit concept is necessary but not sufficient. And you touched on this a few moments ago. To have a business, you've got to think about 4 things. You've got to think about product market, but also business model and channels to that market. So for example, if you want to have a £100 million annual revenue business, you can have 100 million customers at £1 a year, or 10,000 customers at £10,000 a year, both add up to the same annual revenue. But if your market doesn't support those numbers, then you haven't got the business you thought you had. Or if the revenue you're getting from your customers doesn't support your channels to that market, you haven't got the business either. So there's other ways we could analyse that set of 4 things, but we need to think about all 4 of them in play, and we tend not to. We tend to say we're going to build a product and then make sure it fits the market, but markets don't fit your product, it's the other way around. Channels don't fit your product, you build products for channels, and we don't tend to have that growth science-based awareness when we talk about product market fit. But I think more fundamentally, almost everybody I've met in my time have been smart people, well-intentioned. People don't set out to screw up these things. So why is it that most companies struggle with the topic we're talking about here? And I think it's because the fundamental thing that tells you you've got product market fit operates at a frequency much longer than our business environment's willing to tolerate. So for example, we love to talk about customer acquisition because it happens every day.
Yep.
We love to talk about revenue because it goes up or not every month. But the way you know you've got product market fit is because you've got retained users. So the number of users using this product 10 time periods from when they first used it is sufficiently high to maintain a business. Now, the vast majority of businesses don't have the numbers to see that, and don't break them down very well. So you were talking about the case where the business in question is one metric, which is about number of meetings booked. That's a very good start, in my view, because it's not about revenue, it's about usage. But let's now break that down. Let's say that every month you sign up 100 users. You want to have a graph for each of those 100 user cohorts as to how they decline over time and map that back to what you're actually doing in your product. And most businesses don't do that kind of stuff. So that's why we can have this issue of activity. You know, we're doing stuff, we're writing software, you might even be very, very focused on the software, and maybe the CEO or founder isn't generating lots of ideas, and it can feel like we're getting somewhere, but we're not really paying attention to retention. I mean, the metaphor I'd use is imagine, you know, it's a hot sunny day, but even as the sun moves past noon and is going down, the day's still getting hotter.
Yep.
But the sun's going down. So very often in business, it feels like things are heating up, but the sun is setting on your business.
And it's really difficult, especially like if you're in enterprise or something with a slow sales cycle. I mean, somebody confidently told me the other week that they had got 100% retention rate, and I was like, "Oh, what's your contract cycle?" And they're like, "Well, at 12 to 24 months. Well, nothing's up for renewal yet." So you do not have 100% retention rate. It's just you haven't had a churn point yet, and what your indicator's looking like. What's your prediction on what your churn's going to be? Because boy, is that going to be painful. I mean, I know that. I've done multiple businesses in that type of field where, yeah, it looks fine for a while. You're focused on getting people up on board, and then when the first set of renewals come up, they drop off a cliff. And the people that haven't been answering the phone, who you've struggled to get feedback from, are the exact people who churn because they haven't been seeing the value, and so little value have they been seeing that they can't really be bothered to have a conversation with you to tell you how little value that they're seeing from it. So all of that stuff is, the churn is a lagging indicator of a problem that was set in place 9 months ago.
That's a great example of using the wrong metric to monitor retention. A better way to think about retention is a function of engagement. So that scenario you just talked about, you'd have probably seen retention's 100%, but engagement 0. So, because I'm not using the product, but I'm still going to pay the bill till the thing runs out, the contract runs out. So I think you've got to be saying the one metric, if it's one, I think that's a good goal, needs to be somewhat keyed off engagement levels, and it needs to match the natural frequency of usage. So if you're supposed to use this thing every week and you're not using it every week, the contract might be every year, but you're fooling yourself. So I think most of us get that wrong most of the time. I know I have, and I wish I'd known that earlier, and I would have probably operated differently. But I think that's why many businesses have activity without eventual success, because of this very issue. And things like the founder going in an information overdrive sometimes might just be because, as I said earlier, the founder hasn't scaled him or herself, but sometimes it's because there's a non-verbalised realisation that we ain't got engagement, what we're going to do to get it. So a great example of looking at symptoms and trying to trace it back to root causes.
And I think that as a founder, you have to be honest with yourself and go, this happens. In fact, what was it, like 4 out of 5 startups fail. So for at least 4 out of 5 startups, this happens. This is normal. Even for the one that succeeds, they probably went through this multiple times. So this is a normal state of affairs. Don't panic. Don't scare the crap out of your people. You now need to go into a process and actually handle this in a quite structured way of informed but rapid learning, and it's doable, and I dedicated about 6 weeks to that, and it actually worked very, very well. And the idea that we came out with, that we felt had been validated by both the customer and our internal capabilities to deliver, we did score out on a spreadsheet, and it was one of the least sexy ideas of 25 on a page, but actually it scored higher than anything else on our ability to do it, the customer's ability to implement it, the simplicity of the buying unit, the lack of competition in the space, the lack of complexity to integrate, all of this kind of thing. It's like, okay, right, this is a thing worth doing a valid experiment on, and we know how we're going to measure if it worked. That was like a really systematic way of doing it. Whereas the kind of shoot the messenger approach, which I have seen happen, and I've, earlier on in my career definitely been at the receiving end of that, of the, you happen to be the person dealing with the client and the client happens to have some bad news, you don't kick the account manager. You kind of try to learn through that, but that is, I suspect, a fear reaction in some ways, which is like literally don't tell me something that is telling me that my startup isn't going to work.
Yes, don't challenge the version of reality I've created. I mean, Andy Grove, the former CEO of Intel, and regarded by many as maybe the top executive that Silicon Valley's ever produced, he was fond of saying that you have to encourage Cassandras in your business. Not people named Cassandra necessarily.
Cassandra effect.
Yes, the forewarning of problems. And he would stay very close, in particular, to his frontline sales team. And I think that the quote I always like that illustrates this is from Moby Dick, funnily enough, and it's about how the captain's at the back of the ship, and it's the sailors at the front that smell the wind changing first. And you've got to set up your business and your culture so that information gets to the captain. And we often do the opposite. We often people feel reluctant to share bad news, and bad news gets diluted as it moves upwards, and so on and so forth. It's interesting in China, people talk about the terrible Great Leap Forward and how so many millions of people died. It was an absolute tragedy. I was surprised to learn it wasn't so much that Chairman Mao knew that was happening, because the culture was to give the chairman good news. So every report that said the crops are failing got slightly adjusted as it went through 20 levels of bureaucracy.
Right.
So when it got to the most senior levels of Chinese government at the time, the message was everything's going really well, and people were starving to death. Now, in a less dramatic and tragic fashion, our companies often do that as well. We tend to discourage people from sharing news which upsets the convenience of the reality that we've created for ourselves. Now, forewarned is forearmed, so if we know all these things are going to be risks, if we know that retention is the game, that engagement is the way of noting retention, that one metric's important, etc., then we can build our governance to enshrine those things. I've found it in practice very, very difficult to retrofit learning metrics or leap of faith assumptions or any of that stuff into a business that's already up and running. It's much, much easier to do it at the start before other behaviours and habits are set.
So for using the example that you did earlier with the software, I mean, a way better measurement for that from the very beginning would have been if it was on weekly logins. It's like literally how many weekly logins per customer per week, or a metric that's showing your number of clients and your number of logins and your number of logins per client per week, because you're soon going to see that flatlining out, and then that's not the blame. The blame is not then pointed at, you product manager or you account manager or you sales or you whoever. That's just out there, and that company's responsibility, because everybody's driving towards it, is to go, hell, this isn't working as we thought it would. What are we going to do now? Whereas when that gets hidden away, and it's like the half-read version or non-read version of Lean Startup. If you're just thinking about MVPs and that you can iterate your way out of that, you're missing the point. Because done well, those metrics are the flip side of that. That's what you're trying to prove in or prove out. And having that exposed and understood is really critical. As a final point then, because this focus is so critical, and because the founder, particularly perhaps a struggling or inexperienced founder, is the person that undermines it as well as it sets it. How do you think that the leadership as a team should be both setting and communicating this focus? I mean, on a periodic basis, but also on an ongoing basis.
So the way I think about this is, imagine two variables here. So one is how often, or let's say how strategic is the item. So we're going from strategic to tactical. You imagine sort of left to right, and then how often should you communicate on those items? Now these things are essentially inversely proportional. So you should change your strategy as little as possible and communicate that strategy as often as possible. And as you move out from there, the things that are more frequent, such as within that strategy we're building these 3 things this quarter, you should communicate about quite a lot but not as much. And then the small details and tweaks you don't have to communicate at all.
Yeah.
We tend to do it the other way round. We tend to not talk about the core strategy very much, and we tend to talk about the latest set of changes we're making a lot. And that leaves people with lacking an intellectual foundation to understand what the management team is trying to do. So, lesson I learned there, I think, is find a way to really crisply communicate your core direction and communicate it all the time in lots of different channels, one-to-ones, company meetings, screens around the office, posters when you lift up the toilet lid, maybe not, but that kind of stuff.
Google does those. Learning on the loo, the back of the door seat.
Checking the toilet and things like that. Never been quite sure about the hygiene of that one, but the point is, you've got to really communicate that a lot, because if you get that right, all the micro decisions people make every day where you're not there will be grounded in the context of your strategy. Now, the other side of this is that means you don't change your strategy very often. You change it if you have to pivot, but that shouldn't be very often. It's fine when you're a very, very early startup and you're trying to find your way. When you start to get to more sort of traction, product market fit starting to materialise, you've got to be careful that changes to strategy ripple in eternity.
Yep.
And people get confused and have to have meetings and understand it, and you're reducing their ability to get stuff done. So that's kind of how I think about it. And founders or CEOs or leaders tend to under-communicate the stuff that doesn't change very often because they assume everybody knows it.
Yep.
But they almost certainly don't unless you're reminding them all the time. I was always very struck in Cisco at its height. Every time the CEO spoke, he repeated the 4-point plan.
Mm-hmm.
He found ways to just get it in there as he was saying hello to someone, just incessantly to the point where it hurt, but we all knew the 4-point plan. And I think that's a good model.
And I think that's really important, because one of those articles I read quite often is, have you got a strategy? And I also love a book called Hope is Not a Strategy. But actually, we forget about the strategy. A product roadmap is not a strategy. An operational plan is not a strategy. A release schedule is not a strategy. A marketing communication plan is not a strategy. Those are executional things. And when all the focus and all the communication is going there, and they are also the dynamic things. They are the things that are most likely to shift around. And I suspect, as we wrap up, probably what the person asking this question is talking about is constant shift in this
strategy
part of stuff, and probably literally no communication around the strategy. Because if the strategy is changing anywhere near as much as they're implying, then it's quite hard to know what on earth the company is doing or existing for.
Yes, it could well be that, or it could be that strategy exists but it's just not being communicated. Because one of the mistakes that I think it's very easy to make as a management team is, let's say you've got 300 people in your company and 10 people kind of overall manage the company. They tend to spend weeks in a room trying to figure out what the strategy is, and when they're doing that, they're implicitly building a intuition for that strategy, and then they go out, and there's elements of political compromise in that strategy. Then they go out and stand up and say to everybody, here's the strategy in a 1-hour presentation, and expect everyone to get it, who didn't spend weeks building an intuition, understanding why that branch should be pruned and so on. So you've got to remember that the people you're hearing what you're saying have no context, and you've got weeks of intuition, so it's now implicit. So it's very important to find a way to tell the story that assumes no starting context, but we usually get that wrong. Yeah.
And then that's when you get the kickback as you brief stuff into different teams, and they go, well, why are we doing this, and haven't you thought of that, and surely we should do it this way. And
also a great example that the worst type of meetings are horizontal meetings. We're all at the same grade, let's talk. Often the best strategies are informed by frontline knowledge. So whenever I had a meeting and it was all people at the same grade, I usually was concerned because we weren't taking in frontline wisdom, and that's important.
As ever, a lovely pleasure to talk to you. Thank you for stopping by my sofa. You've been listening to Vicky Brock and Mark Logan, this week's Entrepreneur Agony Aunts. You can ask your question at vickybrock.com/podcast.